tonight, we will explore the intricate and complex world of ancient Roman taxation, a subject that spans nearly 1,000 years of history and touches every aspect of Roman life, from the humblest farmer in the countryside to the wealthiest senator in the capital city. The Roman tax system was not created in a single moment, but evolved gradually over centuries, adapting to the changing needs of the state and the expanding territories under Roman control. In the earliest days of Rome, when it was merely a small settlement of farmers and herders on the hills above the Tiber River, taxation was a simple affair. But as Rome grew from a kingdom to a republic, and finally into a vast empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, the tax system grew correspondingly complex and sophisticated. The story of Roman taxation is in many ways the story of Rome itself, reflecting its military conquests, its political struggles, its economic development, and ultimately its decline and fall. Let us begin at the very beginning, in the period of the Roman kingdom, which lasted from the legendary founding of Rome in 753 BC until the expulsion of the last king in 509 BC. During this early period, Rome was governed by kings who held absolute power, though they were advised by a council of elders known as the Senate. The primary form of taxation during the kingdom period was the tributum, a property tax that was levied on Roman citizens based on the value of their land holdings. This tax was not collected annually, but only when the state needed funds for specific purposes, most commonly to finance military campaigns or public works projects. The amount each citizen owed was determined by a census, which was conducted periodically to assess the wealth and property of all citizens. The census was not merely a tax assessment tool, but also served to determine each citizen's place in the social and military hierarchy of Rome. Citizens were divided into classes based on their wealth, and each class had different military obligations and different voting rights in the assemblies. The wealthiest citizens, who owned the most property, were expected to serve in the cavalry and had the greatest influence in political matters, while poorer citizens served as infantry or were exempt from military service altogether. The tributum was theoretically a loan to the state rather than a permanent tax, and there are records of it being repaid to citizens when Rome enjoyed particular prosperity, though this became increasingly rare as Rome's military ambitions grew. In addition to the tributum, the Roman state collected various indirect taxes and fees during the kingdom period. There were customs duties on goods entering and leaving the city, tolls on the use of roads and bridges, and fees for the use of public facilities such as markets and harbors. These indirect taxes were often collected by private contractors known as publicani, who would bid for the right to collect specific taxes in exchange for a fixed payment to the state. This system of tax farming, as it was called, would become increasingly important in later periods of Roman history, and would be a source of both great wealth and great corruption. When the Roman kingdom ended in 509 BC and was replaced by the Roman Republic, the basic structure of taxation remained largely unchanged, but the political context in which taxes were collected became more complex. The Republic was governed by elected magistrates, primarily the two consuls who held executive power for one-year terms, along with various other officials, including praetors, aediles, and quaestors. The Senate, which had been merely an advisory council under the kings, now became the most powerful political body in Rome, though it had no formal legislative power and could only make recommendations to the assemblies of citizens. The question of who would pay taxes and how much they would pay became intimately connected with the question of political power and representation. The early republic was marked by a long struggle between the patricians, the old aristocratic families who had monopolized political power under the kings, and the plebeians, the common people who demanded greater political rights and protection from the economic exploitation by the wealthy. One of the major grievances of the plebeians was the burden of debt and taxation. Many plebeian farmers had fallen into debt to patrician creditors and faced the prospect of debt bondage, a form of slavery in which debtors who could not pay their obligations were forced to work for their creditors. The plebeians demanded debt relief and protection from arbitrary taxation, and they achieved significant reforms through a series of political struggles known as the Conflict of the Orders. In 494 BC, the plebeians staged the first of several secessions, withdrawing from the city and refusing to participate in military service until their demands were met. This first secession led to the creation of the tribunes of the plebs, officials elected by the plebeian assembly who had the power to veto actions by magistrates and protect plebeians from abuse. Over the following 2 centuries, the plebeians gradually won more rights, including the right to hold all political offices and to have their assembly decisions recognized as binding law. These political changes had important implications for taxation. The most significant change came in 167 BC when the tributum, the direct property tax on Roman citizens, was suspended following Rome's conquest of Macedonia and the capture of the Macedonian royal treasury. With this enormous influx of wealth from conquered territories, Rome no longer needed to tax its citizens directly for ordinary expenses. This suspension of direct taxation would last for over a century and was seen as one of the great benefits of Roman citizenship. However, it is important to note that this did not mean Romans paid no taxes at all. They continued to pay various indirect taxes, fees, and duties, and they were still subject to extraordinary levies in times of emergency. Moreover, the suspension of direct taxation applied only to Roman citizens in Italy itself, not to the provinces, where taxation continued and indeed intensified as Rome's empire grew. The late Republic saw increasing problems with the tax system as corruption and abuse became endemic. Provincial governors, who typically served for 1 year and were not directly compensated by the state, saw their governorships as opportunities to enrich themselves through extortion, bribery, and collusion with tax collectors. The most famous example of this corruption was Gaius Verres, who served as governor of Sicily from 73 to 71 BC and was prosecuted by the young orator Cicero for his rapacious exploitation of the island. Although Verres fled into exile before his trial concluded, Cicero's speeches against him, which were published and circulated widely, provide a detailed picture of the corruption and abuse that characterized late Republican provincial administration. Verres had systematically plundered Sicily, seizing artworks and valuables, imposing illegal taxes, and collaborating with publicani to extract wealth from the Sicilians far beyond what was legally owed. The chaos of the late Republic, marked by civil wars and political violence, placed additional strains on the tax system. The various warlords and political factions needed money to pay their armies, and they often resorted to extraordinary taxation, confiscation of property, and outright plunder. The proscriptions of Sulla in 82 BC and the triumvirate of Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus in 43 BC saw thousands of wealthy Romans killed and their property seized to fund political and military operations. Even ordinary taxation became more burdensome as the state struggled to finance multiple armies and maintain order. The publicani continued to exploit the provinces, and their power and wealth grew to the point where they could influence political decisions in Rome itself. The Senate and assemblies were often reluctant to pass laws that would limit the publicani's activities because many senators and other wealthy Romans had invested in publicani companies and profited from provincial exploitation. The transformation of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire under Augustus brought significant reforms to the tax system. Augustus, who ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD, understood that the corruption and inefficiency of the republican tax system could not continue if the empire was to be stable and prosperous. One of his first major reforms was to conduct a comprehensive census of the entire empire to determine the population and resources of all provinces. This census, which is mentioned in the Gospel of Luke as the reason for Mary and Joseph's journey to Bethlehem, was an enormous undertaking that took many years to complete and required the cooperation of local officials throughout the empire. The census data allowed Augustus to create a more rational and equitable system of taxation based on actual resources and population rather than on the arbitrary assessments that had characterized the republican system. Augustus reformed the direct taxation system in the provinces by establishing more standardized procedures for assessment and collection. While the specific rates and methods of collection still varied by province, reflecting local traditions and economic conditions, there was now greater central oversight and regulation. Augustus also took steps to reduce the role of the publicani in direct tax collection, particularly for the land tax, which was increasingly collected by provincial officials under the supervision of the governor. The publicani continued to collect indirect taxes such as customs duties, but their power and opportunities for abuse were reduced. Augustus established a professional civil service to administer the empire, including financial officials known as procurators who were responsible for managing imperial revenues and overseeing tax collection. These procurators were often freedmen or equestrians who owed their positions to the emperor and were loyal to him rather than to the Senate or other traditional power structures. Another important reform under Augustus was the reorganization of the army and its payment system. Under the Republic, soldiers had been expected to provide their own equipment and had been compensated primarily through booty and land grants after their service. This system had contributed to the rise of powerful generals who could command the loyalty of their troops through promises of rewards, leading to the civil wars that destroyed the Republic. Augustus created a professional standing army with fixed terms of service and regular pay. Soldiers served for 20 or 25 years and received a salary paid by the state, along with bonuses upon discharge. To finance this system, Augustus established a military treasury, the aerarium militare, funded by two new taxes, a 5% tax on inheritances and a 1% tax on auction sales. These taxes applied only to Roman citizens and were controversial, as they represented a return to direct taxation of citizens after more than a century of exemption. However, Augustus successfully argued that the security provided by the professional army justified the cost, and the taxes were accepted, though they remained unpopular. The inheritance tax, in particular, was seen as burdensome by wealthy Romans who had accumulated large estates and wished to pass them intact to their heirs. The tax applied to all inheritances above a certain minimum value, except for bequests to very close relatives, and the rate was set at 5% of the estate's value. This may seem modest by modern standards, but Roman estates could be enormous, and 5% of a large estate represented a substantial sum. Some wealthy Romans attempted to avoid the tax through various legal maneuvers, such as transferring property before death or structuring their wills to take advantage of exemptions, but the state generally succeeded in collecting the tax. The revenue from the inheritance tax, along with the auction tax and other sources, was sufficient to fund the military treasury and ensure that soldiers received their pay and discharge bonuses regularly, which helped maintain discipline and loyalty in the army. Under Augustus and his successors in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the Roman tax system continued to evolve and become more sophisticated. The emperors kept detailed records of what was coming in and what was going out, and they would adjust tax rates and how they collected them whenever needed to keep the state financially stable. There was this document called the Ratio Studiorum, which was basically a super detailed annual budget. It laid out all the resources the state had and all the things it had to pay for. This was top secret stuff, known only to the emperor and his closest advisors. But we know it existed from ancient writings, which tells us that the emperors were really serious about financial planning and tried hard to keep a balanced budget. Of course, it wasn't easy. The imperial government was always under pressure to spend. There was the army, which was a huge expense. Then there were public buildings and infrastructure projects like roads and aqueducts. They also had grain distributions for the urban poor, public entertainment like the gladiator games, and of course, the cost of running the imperial court itself. It was a constant balancing act. One of the biggest ticket items for the Roman state was something called the annona. This was the system for supplying grain, either for free or at a very low price, to the people living in Rome and later in other big cities. The idea started back in the late Republic, when politicians would hand out grain to win votes. Augustus made it official, creating a permanent system with its own bureaucracy to handle everything from getting the grain to shipping it and handing it out. So where did all this grain come from? Mostly from Egypt. After Augustus conquered it, Egypt became his personal property. It wasn't run by a senator like other provinces, but by a special official. Egypt's land was incredibly fertile and produced massive amounts of grain. A huge portion of that was shipped straight to Rome to feed the city's population. The cost of the annona was astronomical, but the emperors saw it as a necessary expense. It was crucial for keeping public order and preventing riots in the capital. You've probably heard the phrase, bread and circuses, right? That perfectly sums up the Roman government's strategy. Keep the city folk happy with free food and spectacular entertainment, and you'll keep the peace. It was a powerful tool for social control in a massive, bustling city like ancient Rome. The tax system in Egypt itself was particularly complex and well documented due to the survival of numerous papyri that record tax assessments, payments, and disputes. Egypt had a long tradition of state control over agriculture and taxation, dating back to the Pharaonic period, and the Romans adapted this system to their own needs. Every piece of agricultural land in Egypt was registered and assessed for tax purposes, and farmers were required to pay a portion of their harvest to the state. In addition to the land tax, Egyptians paid numerous other taxes, including a poll tax, taxes on various trades and professions, taxes on livestock, and many others. The total tax burden in Egypt was quite high, perhaps amounting to as much as 30 to 40% of agricultural production, and the Egyptian population suffered considerably under Roman rule. However, the revenue from Egypt was essential to the functioning of the empire, and the emperors guarded their Egyptian possessions jealously, prohibiting senators from even visiting the province without imperial permission. The extension of Roman citizenship to more people in the provinces had important implications for taxation. Under the Republic and early Empire, Roman citizenship was a privileged status that brought various rights and protections, including exemption from certain taxes and from corporal punishment. As Rome incorporated more territory and granted citizenship to more people, either individually or to entire communities, the distinction between citizens and non-citizens became increasingly blurred for tax purposes. The Constitutio Antoniniana, issued by the Emperor Caracalla in 212 AD, granted Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. While this edict is sometimes portrayed as a generous act of inclusion, it also had significant fiscal implications, as it made more people subject to the inheritance tax and other citizen taxes, while not necessarily exempting them from provincial taxes. Some historians argue that increasing tax revenue was actually Caracalla's primary motivation for issuing the edict, though others emphasize the political and social benefits of universal citizenship. The 3rd century AD was a period of severe crisis for the Roman Empire, and the tax system came under tremendous strain. The empire faced threats on multiple fronts from Germanic tribes, Persians, and other enemies, requiring large armies and enormous military expenditure. At the same time, the empire experienced political instability with frequent changes of emperor, often through military coups and civil wars. The economy suffered from inflation, debasement of the currency, disruption of trade, and declining agricultural production. To meet these challenges, emperors repeatedly raised taxes and imposed new levies, but the tax increases often had counterproductive effects as they drove taxpayers into poverty or rebellion and caused further economic decline. The traditional system of tax collection, which relied heavily on local elites who were responsible for collecting taxes from their communities and delivering them to the state, began to break down as these local officials found themselves unable to collect sufficient revenue and personally liable for shortfalls. The reforms of the Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 AD, attempted to address these problems through a comprehensive reorganization of the empire's administration and tax system. Diocletian divided the empire into smaller administrative units, increasing the number of provinces and creating a hierarchy of officials to govern them. He separated civil and military authority, creating separate chains of command for provincial governors and military commanders. Most importantly for our purposes, Diocletian reformed the tax system by replacing the traditional land tax based on the value of production with a new system based on units of assessment called iuga and capita. An iugum represented a standard unit of agricultural land, with the size of the unit varying based on the quality of the soil and the type of crops grown, while a capit represented a unit of labor. Taxpayers were assessed based on the number of iuga and capita they possessed, and the tax rate was set annually by the emperor based on the state's financial needs and the total number of assessment units in the empire. This new system, known as the iugatio capitatio, was intended to create a more flexible and equitable system that could adjust to changing circumstances. By basing taxation on standardized units rather than on variable harvests and prices, the state hoped to create more predictable revenue streams and reduce disputes over assessments. The system also attempted to account for different types of land and economic activity by establishing different ratios for converting various types of property into standard assessment units. For example, a certain amount of vineyard land might be equivalent to a larger amount of grain-producing land because vineyards produced higher value crops. Similarly, different types of workers were counted differently toward capita assessments, with agricultural laborers, artisans, and others having different values. The complexity of the system required an enormous bureaucracy to administer, with officials responsible for conducting censuses, maintaining tax registers, assessing properties, and collecting payments. Diocletian also attempted to address the problem of inflation and currency debasement through his famous price edict of 301 AD, which set maximum prices for thousands of goods and services throughout the empire. The edict listed prices for everything from basic foodstuffs to luxury goods, from wages for various types of labor to fees for professional services. Violations of the price controls were subject to severe penalties, including death. The edict also tried to stabilize the currency by reforming the coinage system and issuing new coins with higher precious metal content. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The price controls were widely evaded and proved impossible to enforce across the vast empire, and they were quietly abandoned after a few years. The currency reforms provided some temporary relief, but did not solve the underlying economic problems that had caused inflation in the first place. The tax reforms of Diocletian were continued and refined by his successor, Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337 AD. Constantine made several important changes to the tax system, including the introduction of new taxes and the modification of existing ones. One significant innovation was the collatio lustralis, also known as the chrysargyron, a tax on merchants and artisans that was collected every 5 years. This tax was particularly hated because it was assessed on the capital value of businesses rather than on profits, meaning that even struggling merchants who made little or no money still had to pay, and because the collection methods were often harsh and oppressive. The tax collectors would arrive in cities and towns on the due date and would seize and sell the property of those who could not pay, sometimes even forcing people into debt bondage or prostitution to raise the necessary funds. The chrysargyron remained in effect until it was abolished by the Emperor Anastasius in 498 AD, to the great relief of the commercial classes. Constantine also reformed the currency system by introducing a new gold coin called the solidus, which became the standard gold coin of the Roman and later Byzantine Empire for centuries. The solidus was struck at a rate of 72 to the Roman pound of gold and maintained a relatively stable weight and purity for much of its existence. Many taxes were now required to be paid in gold solidi rather than in the increasingly debased silver and bronze coins, which placed a heavy burden on taxpayers who had to obtain gold coins to meet their obligations. This shift toward gold taxation reflected the general decline of the monetary economy in many parts of the empire and the increasing importance of payments in kind rather than in coin. The state increasingly demanded that taxes be paid in goods such as grain, oil, wine, meat, and clothing rather than in money, particularly for supplying the army. The system of requisitions in kind, known as the annona militaris, became a major feature of late Roman taxation and required a complex logistical apparatus to collect, store, transport, and distribute the goods. The division of the Roman Empire into eastern and western halves, which became permanent after the death of Theodosius I in 395 AD, created two separate tax systems that gradually diverged in their organization and efficiency. The Eastern Empire, governed from Constantinople, maintained a more effective and centralized tax administration and generally had greater financial resources than the West. The East benefited from more prosperous provinces, including Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, which were relatively protected from barbarian invasions and maintained higher levels of economic activity. The Eastern emperors were able to collect sufficient revenue to maintain a professional army. The Eastern Empire also benefited from its control of major trade routes and from customs revenues on goods passing through its territories. The Western Empire, by contrast, faced increasing fiscal difficulties as it lost control of its wealthiest provinces to barbarian invasions and settlements. Britain was abandoned in the early 5th century, and much of Gaul, Spain, and North Africa were lost to various Germanic peoples, including the Vandals, Visigoths, Burgundians, and Franks. As the Western Empire's territory and tax base shrank, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the army and administration necessary to defend what remained. The Western emperors became increasingly dependent on barbarian military leaders who commanded the remaining effective military forces, and these leaders often controlled tax revenues for their own purposes. The system of tax collection in the remaining Western provinces became increasingly chaotic and oppressive, with multiple layers of officials and military commanders all demanding payments from an impoverished and declining population. The role of local elites in tax collection became increasingly burdensome during the late Empire. City councillors, known as curiales or decurions, were made collectively responsible for collecting taxes from their cities and the surrounding countryside, and for making up any shortfalls from their own resources. This obligation became hereditary, and members of the curial class found themselves trapped in increasingly impoverished cities, forced to use their own wealth to meet tax quotas while their economic base eroded. Many curials attempted to escape their obligations by fleeing to other locations, joining the army or the church, or placing themselves under the protection of powerful landowners. The imperial government repeatedly issued laws trying to force curiales to remain in their cities and fulfill their duties, but these laws were increasingly ineffective. The decline of the curial class and the urban civilization they supported was one of the major social transformations of the late Roman period. Large landowners, particularly in the West, became increasingly independent of imperial authority and established what historians call proto-feudal relationships with the peasants who worked their land. These landowners, known as potentiores or possessores, offered protection to small farmers and other vulnerable people in exchange for their labor and loyalty. The protected individuals became coloni, a status somewhere between free peasant and serf, bound to the land they worked and obligated to pay rents and dues to the landowner. The landowners would then pay taxes to the state on behalf of all the people under their protection, giving them considerable power to negotiate with imperial officials and to shield their dependents from the full weight of imperial taxation. This system of patronage and dependency gradually replaced the older system of direct taxation of individuals by the state, and it formed the basis for the medieval feudal system that would emerge after the fall of the Western Empire. The church also became an important economic and fiscal actor during the late Empire, as Christianity became the official religion of the empire in the 4th century. The church accumulated enormous wealth through donations, bequests, and grants from emperors and wealthy individuals. Church property was generally exempt from taxation, which meant that as more land came under church control, the tax base available to support the state diminished. At the same time, bishops and other church officials took on many functions previously performed by imperial officials, including poor relief, maintaining public order, and even collecting taxes in some cases. The church also received and distributed the charitable donations of the wealthy, which represented a form of private taxation parallel to the state system. The relationship between church and state finances was complex and sometimes contentious, with emperors occasionally attempting to tax church property or restrict donations to the church, while church leaders argued for their independence and for greater resources to carry out their religious and charitable missions. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was in terminal decline, and its tax system had largely collapsed. The last effective Western emperor, Majorian, who ruled from 457 to 461 AD, attempted to implement reforms to revive the tax system and restore imperial finances. But his efforts were undermined by military defeats and political opposition, and he was deposed and executed by his own military commander. The subsequent emperors were puppets of barbarian generals, and the imperial government controlled only Italy and small parts of Gaul and Illyria. The barbarian kingdoms that had established themselves in the former western provinces developed their own systems of taxation based partly on Roman models, but adapted to their own needs and circumstances. The Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in North Africa, and the Ostrogoths in Italy all maintained some form of land taxation and continued to use Roman officials and administrative structures for tax collection, though with significant modifications. The final collapse of the Western Empire in 476 AD, when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last emperor Romulus Augustulus and declared himself king of Italy, is often portrayed as a dramatic break with the past. But for most people, the change was probably less significant than it might appear. Tax collection continued, though now the revenues went to barbarian kings rather than to Roman emperors. The administrative structures and personnel remained largely the same, with Roman officials continuing to serve the new masters, The main difference was that the new rulers did not have the resources or the organizational capacity to maintain the extensive system of taxation and public services that had characterized the empire at its height. Taxation became more localized and irregular, and many of the services previously provided by the imperial government, such as maintaining roads and public buildings, distributing grain, and providing public entertainment, were reduced or eliminated. In the Eastern Empire, which continued as the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years, the Roman tax system survived in modified form. The Byzantine emperors maintained a professional bureaucracy to collect taxes and kept detailed records of revenues and expenditures. The land tax remained the primary source of revenue, supplemented by various commercial taxes, customs duties, and extraordinary levies. The Byzantine system continued to use tax farming for some taxes, though the government also employed salaried officials for tax collection. The tax burden in the Byzantine Empire was generally high, and there were periodic rebellions and protests against taxation, most famously the Nika riots in Constantinople in 532 AD, which began as protests against high taxes and corrupt officials and nearly toppled the Emperor Justinian. However, the Byzantine state proved remarkably resilient and was able to adapt its tax system to changing circumstances, maintaining sufficient revenues to support the government, army, and church even as the empire's territory expanded and contracted over the centuries. The legacy of Roman taxation extended far beyond the end of the Roman Empire itself. The Roman system of land taxation, with its emphasis on cadastral surveys and assessment of productive capacity, influenced medieval and early modern tax systems throughout Europe. The concept of tax farming, in which private contractors collect taxes on behalf of the state, persisted in various forms until the modern period. The Roman distinction between direct and indirect taxes and the use of multiple types of taxes to fund government operations became standard practice in later states. Even specific Roman taxes, such as customs duties and inheritance taxes, have clear descendants in modern tax systems. The administrative techniques developed by Roman officials, including censuses, property registers, and accounting procedures, provided models for later bureaucracies. Perhaps most significantly, the Roman experience demonstrated both the necessity of taxation for maintaining a large state and the problems that arise when taxation becomes excessive or oppressive. The Romans understood that taxation was essential to fund the army, maintain infrastructure, provide public services, and support the government, but they also struggled throughout their history with the proper level and distribution of the tax burden. The corruption and abuse that characterized Roman tax collection, particularly in the provinces, showed the dangers of poorly designed tax systems and inadequate oversight. The collapse of the Western Empire demonstrated that even a sophisticated state could fail if it lost the ability to collect sufficient revenue, or if the tax system became so burdensome that it destroyed the economic base it depended upon. These lessons remain relevant to modern states as they design and implement their own tax systems. The study of Roman taxation also reveals important aspects of Roman society and economy that might otherwise be difficult to understand. The tax records that survive, particularly from Egypt, provide detailed information about land ownership, agricultural production, occupations, population, and many other topics. The laws and regulations concerning taxation show how the Romans thought about property rights, citizenship, and the relationship between the individual and the state. The complaints about taxation that appear in literary sources, inscriptions, and papyri tell us about the concerns and hardships of ordinary people and about the gap between the ideals of Roman governance and the reality of Roman administration. In studying Roman taxes, we are studying not just a fiscal system, but an entire civilization in all its complexity, achievement, and ultimate failure. As we conclude this lengthy examination of ancient Roman taxation, we can reflect on how this mundane topic of collecting money from citizens and subjects to fund government operations reveals so much about the rise and fall of one of history's greatest empires. From the simple tributum of the early kingdom through the sophisticated provincial systems of the empire to the increasingly desperate fiscal expedients of the late imperial period, Roman taxation evolved in response to changing military, political, economic, and social circumstances. The Romans created administrative and fiscal innovations that influenced governance for centuries after their empire fell, but they also demonstrated the limits of fiscal policy and the dangers of excessive taxation, corruption, and loss of public trust. In the end, the Roman tax system, like Rome itself, proved unable to adapt quickly enough to the challenges it faced, and the Western Empire collapsed under the weight of military threats, economic decline, and fiscal crisis. The Eastern Empire managed to survive by maintaining more effective tax collection and administration, but it too eventually succumbed to external pressures after a long decline. The story of Roman taxation is thus a story of both achievement and failure, of the possibilities and limits of state power, and of the eternal challenge of funding government operations while maintaining the prosperity and consent of the governed. Now, as this long recitation of Roman fiscal history draws to a close, you may find yourself drifting into sleep, your mind perhaps filled with visions of Roman tax collectors making their rounds, of provincial populations struggling to meet their obligations, of emperors calculating their budgets and planning their expenditures, of the slow grinding machinery of imperial administration working to extract resources from a vast empire. Sleep well, knowing that you have explored one of the most important but often overlooked aspects of ancient Roman civilization. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. Your support means the world to me and helps the channel grow. See you in the next one.